Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. I can't express to you how incredibly cool it is for me to be here with you today and to have the invitation to speak with you. I absolutely love this. Taking a day off of all the sciencey stuff we do in Wageningen and being here with you is just amazing. Yeah, that's me. And I just want to first start by introducing why I'm here talking to you. So I'm from Wageningen University Research. I work sometimes with Americans who call it unpronounceable Dutch University, but Wageningen. Wageningen is about an hour from here, founded 102 years ago as an agricultural and food university. We're consistently #1 in the world in our domain, everything to do with food and ag, and also in the meantime, our living environment and how we interact with the world around us. I am indeed a program manager, which means it's my job to talk about what we do and to curate our program around proteins. So I kind of oversee the work that we do. The work that I'm talking about is going to be a collection from a lot of colleagues, and a couple more of my colleagues will come back and talk to you later today. And I put up on the top of my slide protein transition, which is what we call it. A lot of people hear that and they think that's a kind of shortcut for like we're all going to become vegan. And that's actually not what I mean. I hope today during this presentation to tell you there's a way that we can do plants right and there's a way that we can do meat right. We're not doing either of those right now in the way that we're producing the volumes of food that we're feeding the planet with, but there is a way that we can do it right. And I hope that, if we stop being so polarized and saying vegan versus meat eater and start talking about the right way to do things, that together we can make a lot of progress. So first of all, just let me tell you why I think it's useful and helpful to look at protein specifically. First of all, proteins are the most labor-intensive, resource-intensive macronutrient that we produce. So carbohydrates, growing sugar, it's pretty easy. We don't need a lot to get that done. We really need the fertilizer that we're putting on, the soil quality. We need that for our proteins. And also, of course, you know that animals are a major source of proteins in much of the global diet today, and they are very resource-intensive as well. So if we want to reduce our greenhouse gases, if we want to become more sustainable, we need to think about proteins in particular. The second reason to look at this lens is the growing demand for proteins. And by the calculations that we make, we expect that the world is going to want 30 to 50% more proteins by 2050. And I use that word demand very specifically. You'll hear people take a shortcut and say the world needs more protein. That's not true. And I'm going to actually show you some numbers. We don't need more protein. We're being a little bit greedy when we ask for more proteins, but that's where the trend is taking us. There's pretty much a linear correlation between gross domestic product of a country and meat consumption. That's it. That's where we're headed. That's what we seem to want. I heard some discussion about food security. That's also a really important consideration. When we look at new crops, I heard you talking about moringa. That's an awesome one. You can grow it with few resources. It's on a tree. It's very renewable. High protein content in the leaves, really extraordinary for a leaf. Really cool that you're getting into those kind of crops. But last but not least, I think we have to acknowledge that the overall dietary pattern that we have today, and that's not any individual food. There's no particular food that's bad per se, but just the collection of foods that we're eating is actually causing and contributing to the development of chronic disease. And I do want to say in relation to that that's not protein specific. I'm not going to tell you that eating meat is bad because we don't believe that that's the case. It's actually what we're not eating when we're eating too much animal source foods. When we're eating a lot of meat and we're eating a lot of dairy, we're not eating very many plants. And we basically all have an undersupply of the good phytochemicals that are in the plant and fiber. And we have an oversupply of protein, especially when you live in the Western or a relatively rich country. So these are 4 good reasons why I'm busy with protein, and I hope that you will be too. As I said, there are a few sort of shortcuts that people take. There are also some what I call myths out there. Number 1, I already mentioned, we don't have enough protein to feed the world. That's just not true. I'm going to show you the numbers. Number 2, the other sort of polarization that's out there is saying animals are inefficient, so we should all be vegan. That's a little bit of a shortcut too. That's a little bit too simple and a little bit too basic. There's a good way to do animals. It's just not what we're doing now. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And my colleague Hannah, who will be here tomorrow in one of the panels, will talk about it as well. And the third one is these plant-based alternatives, saying that plant-based alternatives have a lower footprint or that they're more sustainable. Also not true. just like there's a good way to do animals, there's a bad way to do plants. If we highly process them, if we're growing soy in the Amazon and we're cutting down rainforests to grow it, and we're processing that so far into a sort of fake chicken piece, that costs a lot of energy, and all of that contributes and goes along. So not everything that we take for granted or that the average consumer takes for granted is necessarily true. That doesn't mean it's all a bad thing, right? There's good in it, and we have to embrace the good. So let me start with the first one about the protein supply. Do we have enough to feed the world? Basically, we're knocking it out of the ballpark in terms of protein production, right? We're just making way more than we actually strictly need. We can do the math. We know how much protein a person needs per kilogram body weight, and we can estimate what do we need to feed 9 billion people. It's about 175 million tons of protein per year. And as you can see, I hope you can read the numbers. They're a little bit small, but we are making close to 500 million tons of protein globally per year, way more than we need. So we're going to look into what's happening there, what's going on. This is crazy. There are still regions of scarcity. One thing you can look at here, the blue piece of my bar, that's protein that is food quality. So we're only counting protein that could be consumed as food. And this blue bar is protein that we're actually using for feed. So it's protein that would be good enough for us to eat. A lot of it is soy. Soy is delicious, right? We could just sit down and have a plate of tempeh or tofu. It would be fantastic. But instead, we're feeding that, for example, to cattle, and then we're consuming the beef. That's an inherent inefficiency in the system, and one that I think we should get rid of. This food-feed competition is what we call it. It's using things that could be for humans to feed animals. That's totally inefficient, not what we should be up to. You could look at this and say, yeah, Stacy, we've been increasing the amount of proteins that we're producing, but we've also got an increasing population. You can plot that out in a different way. This is proteins per capita, so per person. On average, it varies. It depends on your body weight, male, female, et cetera. An average adult requires about 18 kilograms of protein per year, and right now, actually in 2010, we were producing about 34 kilograms of protein on average per person, way more than we need. So what's going on? What's happening to all that excess protein? Because there are still regions of scarcity, so how can this possibly be? Well, number one, it's very inequitable. So we're not sharing our proteins evenly, and we see regions of overconsumption. So we've actually plotted out all the data. Believe it or not, when I started working on proteins, we didn't even have this data. This is relatively new that we can get our hands on it. But we can look at protein consumption per country worldwide. And pops out at us, I live in Europe, so I feel personally spoken to by the European numbers. Number one, we're over-consuming protein. We get about a third of our protein is excess. Here in the Netherlands, it's 78 grams per person per day. That was our average last year, whereas we need something closer to 50 per person per day. So we're eating way more protein than we need. Please do not buy any protein-fortified products in the supermarket. That's really taking us in the wrong direction. We're under-consuming fiber, and we're under-consuming the healthy phytochemicals. But this is typical. Almost all of Europe looks like this. And what we're also doing here in Europe is getting more than 50% of our proteins from animals. Actually, up to 70% is not unusual. And that's really not what we should be doing. There are other good components that we're not getting from our diets that we need to reduce. I'm not saying meat is bad, but the way we need to move, and I mean we, everyone who lives in Europe, if you live in North America, where I'm originally from, if you live in Australia, and in the meantime, if you live in China, you're probably eating more protein than you need and way over-consuming on the animal protein side. So that's one thing that's happening. I also heard a little bit about food waste in the previous talk. Thank you for that. It's so important. So the other inefficiency that we have in our system is protein loss and waste. So we've actually taken food loss and waste figures, we've converted those to protein, and we found out that we are losing and wasting about 108 million tons of protein per year. Does anybody remember how much we're producing per year? 500, exactly. So that's 1/5. And does anybody remember how much we needed to feed 9 billion people? You're good with numbers. 175. So we're actually wasting just an enormous amount of protein, half of what we would need to feed the global population. About what we need to feed 4 billion people is just being lost or wasted. That's crazy. That's really incredibly inefficient. We need to work on our supply chains. We need to work on how we're losing and wasting food. And only part of that is at the consumer. Part of it, waste, that's what we call waste, is what comes to a consumer. It's in their kitchen and it gets thrown away. Loss is actually happening in the supply chain. You see, for example, oilseed proteins is a big category here. Oilseeds, that's like rapeseed or canola, sunflower, soy in a lot of cases. We press out the oil, and then the rest of that is basically lost and wasted and not used. Interesting source of proteins. It's happening within the food industry that we're learning how to sort of upcycle those into good food, into things we can use. But at the moment, we're still losing an enormous amount of protein here. All right, so that's my sort of background information about how the system, in my words, is kind of messed up. Let's look into the future and see what we can do differently. And in order to get there, I want to start by telling you some things about sustainability and how I think about it. Number one, I think it's important to say nothing is inherently sustainable. Nothing is inherently sustainable or unsustainable. I've got a picture of chickpeas there. A pretty good protein source, actually something delicious. I love to eat chickpeas. I'm a big fan of chickpeas. You know, one way we could do protein transition is just all sitting down to a plate of chickpeas once a week. We'd be in good shape. On the other hand, there is a way to mess up chickpeas, right? If I were to take a can of chickpeas and fly it around the world twice, I think you would agree with me that that's a not very sustainable type of chickpea. And my colleague Ariette, who's here in the audience, is going to talk to you later today about how that's being further processed in the food industry and some of the things we're doing that are also inherently inefficient and that we could do better. So even crops that are efficient to grow can be made unsustainable by the supply chain and the further processing. Now, the other concept to look at is animals. And I want you to start thinking about animals not as a source of protein, but as protein converters. So plants, what do? They take up nitrogen from the soil. Nobody makes new nitrogen, okay? It's just it's a cycle. So plants take up nitrogen from the soil, and they convert that into proteins. And then, we can eat those proteins and get nutrition from it. What happens with animals is actually they don't take up nitrogen, they take in protein, and they give us a different kind of protein. So they're more like protein converters than they are actually creating protein for us. That's not necessarily a problem, except that it's kind of inefficient. So there's a thing called a feed conversion ratio, which means how much protein do I need to give to that animal for it to give me back a kilo of protein, right? And for a chicken, that's something like 2. If we're talking about a cricket or another type of insect, we can get down to like 1.5 or even 1.2, so that's a very efficient converter, but it's still a converter. If we look at a cow, on the other hand, depends exactly on how you count, so you're getting milk and beef, et cetera, but the numbers there are more like 5 to 7 kilos that we have to give to the cow to get a kilo of meat back. So that's inherently inefficient, right? We could have 5 times as much protein if we didn't give it to the cow first. And that's also, again, not necessarily a problem, except that we're giving the cow stuff that we could eat, right? So what we need to do is start giving the cow things that we can't eat and keeping what we produce that's food quality that we can eat for ourselves. So that's why I've written here, feed composition is as important as actually the conversion ratio. Think about grass, right? Because grass, humans are not going to sit down and eat it. Okay, dandelion greens, I heard that. We could all plant dandelions in our yard. But grass, we're not going to sit down and eat. If we would say, let's get rid of all the cows, we have a problem, right? If we were to plow up all that grassland, that's actually an environmental disaster to do that. Don't do that. Rather, we have grass, we have cows. That's okay. A lot less cows than we have right now, but that's part of the plan. So my amazing colleague Hannah, she will be here tomorrow in a panel. She came up with this concept, and she's done some modeling and some calculations, and her name for it is basically animals as recyclers. So the animals are responsible for all the sort of leftovers that we have that we as humans can't eat. So if you think about, we're growing chickpeas, right? We take the pulse of that, we take this little chickpea, and that's what we love. But you've got stems and leaves, and you've got a whole rest of a plant. What are we going to do with that? That's a kind of leftover. That's a residue. We put all the effort in, the farmers put all the effort in to grow this stuff, we might as well use it. That's what our animals can eat. So in Hannah's vision, we have the animals only eating the things that humans can't eat. And she's a brilliant mathematician, a great sort of numbers person. So she's calculated it down, and it's about 25 grams of protein per person per day, which means a lot less animals than we have in Europe right now, but still a reasonable amount of animals. And actually, if you talk about the minimum protein requirements that we have, that would be getting about half of our protein from animal sources and the other half from plant sources, which is about a third of what we consume today because, remember, we're over-consuming protein. Okay, so this is a view on how we could reposition animals in the system and get them working for us. And I promised some information about new protein sources and what sort of things are we looking at and studying. And I'm going to start by talking about some plants, in particular pulses, which can be locally produced. I'm sure they're not super new for you. They're new for the food industry. If you look at meat analogs, for example, they're almost all based on soy and wheat gluten right now. They're very nice crops also to grow because they bind nitrogen into the soil. They actually can capture nitrogen from the air and give it back to the soil. So pulses are a very good way to work toward regenerative agriculture or using less fertilizer on the land. The second category, which might be a little bit slightly more weird, are functional proteins from fruit and vegetable residue, from clippings. I'll tell you a couple of examples that are already introduced by farmer cooperatives here in the Netherlands that are, I think, really cool, and also things that we think are great to do in the coming years. And then last but not least, I'm going to tell you a little bit about fermentative proteins and what that looks like. I think fermentation is just an amazing thing that we're not using it as much as we could, but a really cool potential future direction. So what's happening with pulses right now? Well, you will not have missed this whole plant-based meat analog thing that's happening, right? The supermarket is kind of exploding with that. They're growing pretty incredibly for the food industry, growing quite rapidly. And most of the products, if you pick them up and look at the pack, are still based on soy and wheat gluten. And we all know, sort of soy is a perfect crop. It's a problem with how we're cultivating it right now. It's not the soy's fault. But we see that this is sort of a field that gets a lot more attention. Pea and fava bean are the first sort of pulses that are being used into the meat analogs, but most companies are actively working to get away from soy and wheat gluten. And Ariette will tell you actually how we make things like this that look very close to a steak or look close to meat. But the problem with pulses that we have right now is actually we've been breeding them for starch production. Pea is the one that's most cultivated here in Europe, and that has been a source of industrial starch for a long time. So these peas were optimized actually for the opposite of their protein, for their starch. And now we're all like, oh, pea protein, that's cool. But there's not really much protein in there. So we're working hard to breed varieties of those or to search for varieties of those which are a little bit better for the protein that we're using them for right now. And some of the things we're doing, like fava beans, we can grow them really efficiently here in the Netherlands. It's quite a good yield per hectare, but they taste like a fava bean, right? And not everybody loves that, so we're looking for types of fava bean that are more appropriate if you want to make a plant-based yogurt, for example. Yeah, we have a fava bean fan in the house. Yeah, I like them too, to be honest, but by the time you concentrate them and sort of process them further into a plant-based yogurt, and there's also just the psychology of like a fava bean tasting like a fava bean is a beautiful thing. Your yogurt tasting like a fava bean is a kind of weird experience. How about duckweed? Oh, I have a colleague who's so happy that you asked that question. We're big fans of duckweed. It's incredibly efficient to grow. She tells me to call it water lentils because she thinks that makes it more mentally accessible. Really efficient to grow. It's got a high protein content, like 40% on dry weight in the leaves. It is indeed everywhere. I cannot recommend eating what's out there in the local canal just because we know that it takes up like whatever nasties are in the water around it. So we're working on sort of cultivation systems. It is available in, not in Europe, but I think in North America. You can get, they call it lemna or duckweed as a superfood powder. I've eaten it. I've eaten a soup of duckweed. Really good. It's actually, yeah, lemna, L-E-M-N-A. What we're busy with right now, it's one of the unique crops where we've actually submitted a novel food application within Europe ourselves as an academic institution. That we hardly do that, but we were like, duckweed is so cool, it has to happen. So we submitted a novel food regulation approval to see if we can get duckweed approved for human consumption in Europe. And we are about 2 years into that process, so we think in like a half a year it'll probably be approved as a food. Yeah, so keep your eyes on the news. Great question, thank you for that. All right, so agricultural side streams, what's happening now? Actually, we think these proteins are interesting because they're categorically different than the proteins that we're using now. I won't bother you with too much of the science of that, but the proteins from soy and pulses are plant storage proteins, and these proteins have a different sort of format. Already introduced our potato proteins. They're really cool and they work very well in meat analogs. Sugar beet leaf proteins, there's a picture of sugar beet leaves, obviously cultivated for their sugar. They're also coming to the market, going through the food regulatory process at the moment. And the Netherlands is first in the world in introducing these. And basically that's being done by farmer cooperatives, which is a fantastic model that helps the farmers indeed get that sort of value for their money. We are also looking into tomato stems, pea pods, lettuce roots. They have really cool proteins in them that we can extract and work with that do really interesting things and give you different textures, different sort of functionalities. And the last thing I wanted to tell you about are fermentative proteins. You will probably know mycoproteins, like Quorn is a brand that's based, Quorn is a brand that's based on mycoproteins. But actually, we think that those mycoproteins, that's very limited. That's just like one bacteria that's just sort of, actually, you can see a fungal, one fungi. And there's a whole collection of bacteria and yeast and other fungi that are fantastic. You know, all of the flavor that we love in cheese that comes from the bacteria. There's so much more we can be doing with bacteria and yeast. And when do we stop needing that milk to make the cheese? When can we start eating the bacteria themselves? Can be perfect. They have up 40 or 60% protein in them, can be quite similar to meat. So we're working very actively on that. And last but not least, I think I just wanted to let you know about what's happening in the sort of future science. You will all probably have heard about the Impossible burger that's based on a bloody soy. I don't know if you know how they're making that. So basically what they're doing is they're taking a yeast. It's relatively easy to insert a snippet of DNA into that yeast that makes it make whatever protein you want. So one of the things colleagues of mine are doing, they've taken a yeast and they've actually put in cow DNA into that yeast. Yes, it's a genetically modified organism, so not happening here in Europe anytime soon. You put a little snippet of cow DNA into your yeast and it starts pumping out dairy-identical proteins. Dairy-identical, it is really the exact same as a dairy protein, but now it's coming from a yeast. Interesting, probably a little bit more future forward, but not as future forward as, for example, cultured meat, which gets a lot more attention in the press and is an even harder lift. This is pretty accessible to us. This we can do. We know how to make it pump out proteins. We don't know how to do it cost effective yet, but it's entirely doable at lab scale already now. You have a question? Yeah, would it mean that you can make milk directly from grass instead of via the cow? Yeah, exactly. And there's a startup company here in the Netherlands called Those Vegan Cowboys whose vision is exactly that. They want to use the grass as a feedstock to cultivate yeast and have the yeast pump out dairy-identical proteins. Yeah, I know, a little bit crazy, but we need those people, right? We love those people. Good. I know time is short, so I'm going to skip over this, but this is just an overview of all the different projects and the types of things we have ongoing in this domain. If you're curious, I'll be here. You can come and ask me a question. But this is what we're working toward. So we think in 2050, Europe will look different. We'll be more actively cultivating in the sea, seaweed, microalgae, for example, duckweed on our fresh water. On the land, we'll do a little bit more integrated pulse and grain production, get away from sort of monoculture that we're doing now. We hope that we'll get toward, instead of 70% of our proteins from animal sources, more like 1/3, and that we'll have this fully circular food system where we're not wasting something. We're sort of feeding the animals on things that we humans can't eat. That's what makes sense. Anyway, it was really my pleasure. This is my contact information. You're welcome to reach out. I would love to hear from you, your questions, thoughts, complaints, all of it. Very welcome. Thanks so much.